April 11, 1945. The west bank of the Elbe River. Late afternoon.
Lieutenant General William Simpson stood still, binoculars raised, looking east.
The road beyond the river ran straight toward Berlin. No visible obstacles. No organized resistance.
50 miles of open highway separated the Ninth Army from the German capital. Simpson had 300,000 men under command. His army was intact, supplied, coordinated, and fully mobile.
Multiple crossings had already been forced. Bridgeheads were secure on the eastern bank.
German units were surrendering in columns, abandoning vehicles, weapons, and formations to reach American lines before Soviet forces arrived.
The enemy in front of him no longer resembled an army. It was a retreat. Simpson understood exactly what this meant. The operational barrier had already been crossed. The final natural obstacle west of Berlin was behind him. Momentum favored advance. Time favored advance. 2 days of sustained movement would place American forces in the city center. The war in Europe would effectively end with an American occupation of the capital.
He did not hesitate. Simpson went to the field telephone and called General Omar Bradley at 12th Army Group headquarters. His request was precise and professional. He stated his position, the condition of his forces, and the absence of meaningful resistance.
He requested authorization to continue the advance on Berlin immediately.
There was a pause.
Bradley did not answer at once. He consulted higher authority. The decision did not belong to him.
When Bradley returned to the line, his tone had changed.
The answer was short. The Ninth Army was to halt at the Elbe. No further movement east. No pursuit. No deviation. Simpson challenged the order once. He repeated the facts on the ground. The distance. The condition of the enemy. The opportunity. Bradley repeated the order. It was final. Simpson ended the call and remained where he was. Across the river, the road to Berlin remained empty. His army was not being told to delay or consolidate. It was being told to stop. At the same moment, to the south, similar orders were being issued to the Third Army. George Patton's advance was being redirected away from Berlin entirely. The most aggressive American formations in Europe were being restrained by command decision, not enemy action. The halt at the Elbe was deliberate. It was not caused by logistics, terrain, or resistance. It was a command room decision, issued with full awareness of the military situation. On April 11, 1945, the United States Army reached the threshold of Berlin. And at that threshold, it was ordered to stand still. At that moment, the military opportunity was not theoretical. It was concrete, measurable, and already unfolding.
The German Western Front had ceased to function as a coherent defensive system. Command structures were fractured.
Communications were unreliable or non-existent. Units that still possessed weapons lacked fuel, ammunition, or orders. What resistance remained was localized, uncoordinated, and focused on escape rather than defense. American forces had broken the last operational spine of the Wehrmacht west of Berlin during the March crossings of the Rhine. After that, there was no prepared fallback line. The German High Command no longer controlled maneuver in the west. It reacted after the fact, issuing orders that could not be executed. The Ninth Army's position on April 11 reflected this collapse. Its advance had not been slowed by enemy action but by its own logistical discipline. Supply lines were intact. Fuel was available. Engineer units had already demonstrated their ability to bridge major rivers under fire. Air superiority was total. German aircraft were absent from the battlefield. The terrain east of the Elbe offered no natural defensive advantage. The North German plain was built for movement. Wide roads. Gentle grades. Sparse forest cover. There were no mountain barriers, no dense urban belts before Berlin itself, no fortified river lines remaining between Simpson's lead elements and the capital. German forces understood this reality.
Their behavior was evidence.
Entire formations were surrendering en masse.
Officers were abandoning commands to avoid Soviet capture. Prisoners repeatedly stated the same intention.
They wanted to be taken by Americans.
They believed resistance against the Western Allies was pointless and survival depended on reaching their lines before the Red Army arrived.
This was not propaganda or rumor.
It was observed behavior across multiple sectors.
German troops were not repositioning to block an American drive on Berlin. They were dissolving. The Ninth Army was not alone in recognizing the opening.
To the south, the Third Army had demonstrated what unrestricted maneuver could achieve. Patton's formations had advanced at speeds that exceeded pre-war planning assumptions. They bypassed resistance, seized crossings without orders, and forced German commanders to react to events they could not control. By early April, American operational tempo was dictating the war's pace.
The enemy no longer chose where to fight.
He responded to where Americans appeared.
Under these conditions, a drive on Berlin would not have required a methodical siege. It would have been a pursuit operation.
The objective was political, but the means were purely military.
Speed. Shock. Occupation before reorganization was possible. There was no requirement to defeat large German forces along the route. Most of those forces were already moving in the opposite direction.
The remaining defenders in Berlin itself were poorly supplied, politically constrained, and increasingly focused on the Soviet threat. Their willingness to fight Americans to the end was untested and, based on observed behavior, unlikely. American commanders understood casualty differentials. Urban combat against determined defenders was costly, but only when defenders believed surrender meant annihilation.
Against American forces, German units had repeatedly surrendered when surrounded.
Against the Soviets, they fought until destruction.
That distinction mattered. The operational window was narrow but real.
It existed because the Western Allies had advanced faster than anticipated and because German collapse had outpaced political planning.
The opportunity was not created by ambition. It was created by success.
Time was the critical variable.
Every day of delay reduced the distance advantage.
Soviet forces were advancing from the east under explicit orders to reach Berlin first, regardless of cost. Their progress was slower, but relentless. The race was not symbolic. It was physical.
On April 11, the Americans were ahead. No reinforcement, no redeployment, no additional planning was required to exploit the opening.
The forces were already in place. The command structures already existed.
The only missing element was authorization.
From a strictly military perspective, the conditions were optimal.
The enemy was disintegrating.
The terrain favored movement. Friendly forces possessed overwhelming superiority in supply, coordination, and morale.
It was an opportunity created by battlefield realities, not ambition or hindsight. And it would not last. The warning did not come from speculation or emotion.
It came from preparation, experience, and pattern recognition. General Dwight Eisenhower was not blind to the military picture. He was receiving continuous reports from field commanders, intelligence officers, and liaison staff. He knew how far Simpson had advanced. He knew Patton's pace. He knew German resistance west of Berlin was collapsing. None of this was hidden from him. But Eisenhower was also receiving a different stream of information, one that carried its own authority. Intelligence summaries from Supreme Headquarters described a developing threat far from Berlin. Reports that did not describe collapse, but concentration. Not retreat, but preparation. The assessments were consistent across channels. Signals intercepts. Captured documents. Civilian reports. Reconnaissance analysis. All pointed south. According to these reports, elite German formations were withdrawing deliberately into the Bavarian and Austrian Alps. Not fleeing, but repositioning. SS units. Party loyalists. Specialized troops. The implication was clear. Germany was not finished.
It was changing form.
The intelligence officers described a national redoubt, a fortified mountain complex designed to absorb defeat in the lowlands and prolong the war indefinitely.
Underground factories, stockpiled food, protected command centers, terrain that neutralized armor, air power, and mobility. Eisenhower did not invent this fear.
It was rooted in precedent. He had watched German forces turn terrain into weapons in Italy. He had seen what prepared mountain defenses could cost in time and lives. He had witnessed the Ardennes offensive only months earlier, launched from terrain Allied planners believed unsuitable for large-scale attack. From his perspective, German behavior was consistent with a final defensive transformation. When a conventional army could no longer fight, it would become something else.
Eisenhower's planning staff modeled the consequences. A prolonged guerrilla campaign in the Alps would require years, not months, to suppress. It would tie down divisions needed elsewhere. It would delay redeployment to the Pacific. It would keep casualty lists growing after the public believed the war was over. This was not a battlefield concern. It was a war termination concern. Eisenhower's credibility came from his record of caution validated by experience. He had resisted premature advances before and been proven right. He had prioritized alliance cohesion over speed and maintained operational unity across national forces. He had been selected precisely because he understood that wars were not won by movement alone. He did not discount the opportunity at Berlin. He weighed it against a different risk. A risk that did not appear on frontline maps. To Eisenhower, Berlin was a city. The redoubt was a potential continuation of the war itself. His preparations reflected that assessment. Orders were drafted not for exploitation, but for containment. Forces were positioned to seal off southern Germany. Objectives were reassigned. Momentum was redirected deliberately, not accidentally. This was not indecision. It was foresight shaped by the information he trusted most. The warning he believed was not that Berlin would be lost. It was that the war might not end. The overrule did not arrive as a debate. It arrived as alignment. By mid-April 1945, Eisenhower was no longer balancing competing military proposals. He was managing a system under strain, where battlefield success threatened political fracture. The decision to halt at the Elbe was not contested at the top because it resolved multiple pressures at once. The first pressure was alliance management. The Western coalition existed only so long as its internal compromises held. The Soviet Union had borne the largest casualties of the war. Its armies were already deep in Eastern Europe. Any Western move toward Berlin risked appearing not as a military necessity, but as a challenge to Soviet entitlement. Eisenhower understood that perception mattered more than intent. The occupation zones agreed earlier were not abstract lines. They were political contracts. Berlin lay well inside the Soviet zone. Capturing it would require either handing it over immediately or refusing to do so. Both options carried consequences. One would humiliate Soviet leadership after catastrophic losses. The other would signal open confrontation before the war had formally ended. Neither outcome was acceptable to the civilian leadership Eisenhower served. The second pressure was American domestic reality. The United States had fought for nearly 4 years. Casualties had been high, but they were now expected to stop. The public believed victory was days away. Congress was already discussing demobilization. Families were waiting for transports, not new offensives. An American assault on Berlin would not be bloodless. Even if German resistance was weaker against the Western Allies, no one could guarantee a rapid surrender once inside the city. Any spike in casualties after victory seemed assured would be politically indefensible. Eisenhower did not operate in a vacuum. His authority derived from civilian control. He did not decide what risks were acceptable. He managed those already defined. The third pressure was institutional. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was built to coordinate, not compete. It functioned by consensus, planning cycles, and shared objectives. A sudden unilateral dash on Berlin would fracture that structure.
It would bypass agreed planning processes and force political decisions into military channels. Eisenhower had spent the war suppressing precisely that kind of command behavior. He had tolerated aggressive personalities only when they served coalition goals. When aggression threatened unity, it was constrained.
Patton's objections were therefore immaterial. His operational instincts were understood.
They were also predictable. Eisenhower had spent years managing him for that reason.
Patton represented speed and initiative, but also risk and volatility.
Allowing him or Simpson to dictate the endgame would surrender strategic control to momentum.
That was unacceptable. There was also fear.
Not fear of German resistance, but fear of miscalculation.
Intelligence about the national redoubt reinforced an already cautious inclination. The possibility that Germany might transition into prolonged resistance validated restraint.
Even if that intelligence proved false later, it was credible enough at the time to justify redirecting effort.
In Eisenhower's framework, Berlin did not end the war.
The redoubt threatened to extend it.
Political leadership reinforced this view. Roosevelt had endorsed the occupation framework. Stalin expected compliance. Churchill, though privately uneasy, did not challenge the arrangement openly. No Allied leader demanded Berlin at the cost of alliance rupture.
This convergence of pressures produced a closed decision space. Military logic competed with political necessity, and political necessity prevailed.
Bradley did not argue. He enforced. Simpson did not disobey. He complied. Patton protested, but redirected.
The system functioned as designed. The order to halt was not framed as temporary.
It was absolute. It did not include contingencies or reconsideration triggers.
There was no conditional language tied to Soviet progress or German collapse.
The line was fixed. This finality mattered.
It signaled that the decision was not tactical. It was strategic, rooted in commitments beyond the battlefield.
The overrule was not dramatic. It was bureaucratic. Issued through channels.
Confirmed through repetition.
Reinforced by silence.
No conference was called to revisit the opportunity.
No alternative plan was prepared.
No commander was authorized to exploit conditions if they worsened further. The system chose predictability over advantage. By stopping at the Elbe, Eisenhower locked in an outcome that aligned with political agreements, minimized immediate American casualties, and preserved alliance cohesion through victory.
He also relinquished control over how the war would end in the German capital.
That trade was not accidental. It was the price of command at the coalition level. And once paid, it could not be refunded. The consequence unfolded immediately, even though nothing appeared to change at first.
Along the Elbe, American formations remained in place.
The Ninth Army consolidated its bridgeheads, improved defensive positions, and waited.
Soldiers cleaned weapons, repaired vehicles, and watched traffic flow in the opposite direction. German civilians moved west in desperate columns, carrying what they could.
German soldiers followed them, unarmed, hands raised, intent on surrender. The road to Berlin stayed empty.
To the east, the war did not pause.
Soviet forces advanced methodically toward the capital, absorbing losses without adjusting pace. Their doctrine accepted casualties as the price of certainty.
Orders emphasized speed and encirclement, not preservation. Artillery concentrations increased daily. Entire urban districts were reduced to rubble before infantry advanced. By mid-April, the distance advantage held by American forces had evaporated. Soviet armies crossed the Oder and began the final encirclement. From the Elbe, American units could hear the distant thunder of artillery. It was continuous, rhythmic, and growing louder. At night, the horizon glowed. No new orders arrived. When the assault on Berlin began in earnest, it was unmistakable. The scale of fire exceeded anything American soldiers had experienced in the West. The sound traveled across open ground and water. It was not battle noise. It was annihilation.
German resistance inside the city hardened immediately. Units that had surrendered readily to Americans fought to destruction against the Red Army. Civilians were trapped between orders to resist and fear of occupation. The battle became a contest of endurance measured in blocks and basements. Casualties mounted rapidly. The price paid by Soviet forces was enormous. Tens of thousands killed. Hundreds of thousands wounded. Armor burned in streets too narrow for maneuver. Infantry cleared buildings room by room under direct fire. Progress was relentless, but costly. From the American side of the Elbe, there was no participation, only observation. Patrols reported Soviet units moving between American positions and Berlin. The physical barrier was gone. Even if authorization had been granted, there was nowhere to advance. The opportunity had closed. On April 25, American and Soviet units made contact near the Elbe. The meeting was choreographed and publicized. Photographs captured handshakes, smiles, shared rations. The image presented unity. Behind the cameras, American officers took notes. They observed systematic looting. Organized removal of property. Entire towns stripped of valuables. German civilians were treated not as a defeated population but as spoils. Reports of mass abuse circulated quickly and consistently. This was not isolated misconduct. It was tolerated behavior. American commanders protested informally. Soviet officers deflected or ignored complaints. Discipline, they implied, was a Western concern. The Red Army continued into Berlin. On May 2, the city fell. The German leadership was already gone. Hitler was dead. The flag raised over the ruins carried meaning beyond military victory. It marked possession. The destruction was total. Berlin did not surrender intact. It was taken apart. As Soviet control solidified, boundaries hardened. Areas reached by the Red Army did not reopen. Political structures followed military ones. Provisional administrations answered east, not west. Security services replaced occupation commands. Local resistance was eliminated before it could organize. The war in Europe ended days later. Formal surrender documents were signed. Celebrations erupted across the United States and Western Europe. Soldiers expected redeployment and return. The consequences of stopping at the Elbe did not end with victory. In southern Germany, American forces completed their redirected mission. They advanced into Bavaria and Austria expecting resistance that never materialized. The feared national redoubt did not exist. There were no fortified complexes, no prepared insurgency infrastructure, no prolonged resistance. German units surrendered in orderly fashion. SS formations dissolved. The Alpine terrain offered scenery, not defense. The intelligence that had shaped Eisenhower's decision collapsed under inspection. This realization did not reverse outcomes. It only clarified them. The political map of post-war Europe formed rapidly along the lines of military occupation. Where Soviet forces stood in May, Soviet authority followed. Where American forces stopped, American influence ended. Germany was divided. Berlin was divided. Eastern Europe disappeared behind controlled borders. Governments were installed under supervision. Elections, where held, confirmed predetermined outcomes. The alliance that had defeated Germany transitioned into rivalry without a pause. For the American soldiers who had stood at the Elbe, the consequence was personal. They had reached the end of the war without completing it. They had obeyed orders that denied them participation in the final act. Many never understood why. Some would later read reports of the battle for Berlin. Casualty figures. Descriptions of destruction. They would calculate distances. They would remember the empty road. The decision also shaped internal American military memory. Commanders learned that operational success did not guarantee strategic influence. Political agreements could negate battlefield advantage. Momentum could be discarded by signature.
Patton understood this immediately. He documented it relentlessly. He warned that the line drawn at the Elbe would not move. He predicted that cooperation would end where occupation began.
He was not consulted further. Within months, the divide became formal.
Mutual suspicion replaced celebration. Intelligence operations expanded. Demobilization occurred alongside rearmament. Former allies adjusted doctrine to confront each other.
The cost of avoiding confrontation in April was confrontation later, under different conditions.
None of this was visible on April 11.
On that day, the consequence was silence.
Engines idling. Artillery unheard. Orders obeyed.
The battlefield consequence of the decision was absence.
No American units in Berlin. No Western leverage in the city's fall. No ability to shape events at the moment of collapse.
History did not record the halt as a defeat. It recorded it as compliance. The consequences were not immediate, but they were enduring.
A divided continent. A divided capital. A generation defined by lines drawn when one army stopped and another did not. Those lines began at the Elbe. And once drawn, they held. The post-war record stripped the decision of urgency and left only evidence.
Within weeks of Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams confirmed what frontline units had already discovered. There was no national redoubt.
No fortified Alpine stronghold. No underground industrial complex capable of sustaining resistance.
The reports that had driven the southern pivot dissolved under examination. What had appeared as preparation had been dispersal. What had been interpreted as concentration had been collapse.
Captured German officers were direct.
No coordinated plan existed to continue the war from the Alps. Hitler had issued contradictory orders, none of which were resourced or executable.
The idea of a final mountain fortress had been encouraged deliberately by German propaganda. It required no construction, only belief.
The intelligence failure was acknowledged quietly. There was no public reckoning.
No after-action correction circulated through command channels.
The war had ended, and responsibility dispersed into institutional silence.
Eisenhower's own post-war statements reflected restraint, not regret.
He defended the halt as a necessary act of coalition management. He emphasized the occupation agreements and casualty avoidance.
He did not revisit the intelligence premise in detail. His justification remained political rather than operational. Bradley followed the same line.
In his memoirs, he framed Berlin as a symbol rather than an objective. He argued that American forces had achieved what mattered and avoided unnecessary losses. The decision was presented as prudent, inevitable, and correct. Simpson was more reserved.
His private papers revealed unease rather than protest.
He noted the clarity of the military situation at the Elbe and the abruptness of the halt. He did not challenge the order, but neither did he retroactively justify it.
His tone suggested a professional obeying instructions he did not issue. Patton did not temper his assessment.
In letters written immediately after the war, he described the decision as a strategic surrender of leverage.
He recorded his belief that the Soviet Union would not withdraw from any territory it occupied. He predicted a divided Europe governed by force rather than agreement.
These views were not speculative. They were observational, drawn from what he had seen on the ground. Patton's criticisms made him politically untenable in peacetime. His public comments, already abrasive, clashed with the narrative of Allied unity.
He was reassigned, sidelined, and ultimately removed from meaningful command.
His warnings were treated as temperament, not analysis. After his death, his assessments were gradually re-examined.
Not celebrated, but acknowledged.
As the Cold War hardened, the line established in April 1945 became permanent. Temporary occupation zones became sovereign borders. Berlin remained divided. Eastern Europe was absorbed into a closed system enforced by military presence and internal security forces. American policymakers who had prioritized cooperation over confrontation in 1945 now faced a geopolitical reality shaped by that restraint. Every crisis that followed traced its origin to the same fact. Where the Red Army stood at the end of the war, it stayed. Declassified documents from both sides confirmed this outcome was anticipated by Soviet leadership. Stalin had never intended to relinquish control of territory won by force. The occupation agreements were tools, not commitments. Compliance by the Western Allies was noted, not reciprocated. In hindsight, the decision at the Elbe was neither a blunder nor a betrayal. It was a choice made within a specific framework of assumptions. Those assumptions proved false or incomplete. The framework itself remained unquestioned at the time. No post-war inquiry reassessed the halt as an operational decision. It was categorized as diplomacy executed through military order. As such, it escaped the scrutiny normally applied to battlefield outcomes. The record shows no alternative plan prepared in case the redoubt proved illusory. No contingency authorized for renewed advance if Soviet forces accelerated. Once the halt was ordered, the outcome was accepted. This acceptance defined the post-war world. By the time the implications were fully understood, the moment had passed. Forces had demobilized. Public appetite for confrontation had vanished. The opportunity that existed in April was no longer available in August. The post-war record does not ask whether Berlin could have been taken. It shows that no serious attempt was made to reconsider the decision once its premises collapsed. That silence is itself part of the evidence. The case was closed not by victory, but by exhaustion. And history moved forward from the line where the advance stopped. The decision was made in a command room, not on a battlefield. On April 11, 1945, American forces stood within reach of Berlin. They had the men, the fuel, the roads, and the momentum. The enemy in front of them was collapsing. The enemy behind them was surrendering. Nothing in the military situation required a halt. The order came anyway. It was issued to preserve an alliance, honor political agreements, and prevent a war that leaders feared might continue in a different form. It was justified by intelligence that later proved false and assumptions that later proved incomplete. The consequence was not abstract. Berlin fell to another army at another cost. The city's capture determined who would define victory in Europe. The line where American forces stopped became the boundary of influence for the next half-century. It did not shift. It did not soften. It hardened. The war ended. The alliance dissolved. The division remained. No inquiry reversed the decision. No post-war correction reopened the moment. The halt at the Elbe became an accepted fact, insulated by success elsewhere and by the exhaustion of victory. This was not a failure of courage. It was a choice of priorities. Military opportunity was subordinated to political stability. Immediate certainty was chosen over long-term leverage. Control was surrendered to avoid confrontation, and confrontation arrived later under worse conditions. History did not record the halt as a mistake. It recorded it as obedience. The American army did what it was ordered to do. It stopped. What followed was not unforeseeable. It was simply not addressed when it could still be influenced. That is the closed record. If you want more investigations like this, subscribe to the channel. If you have a perspective grounded in evidence, leave a comment.